I'm Rebecca. I'll be co-presenting with Rob, who's sitting down here. And our paper is Playing for Fun, Training for War. What can military simulations teach us about violent video games? So I'll begin by saying that this paper is a work in progress, and we appreciate feedback and challenges to the arguments we put forward today. Video games are amongst the most popular forms of contemporary media, yet violent video games remain an ongoing source of social discomfort and political contestation. Despite many studies of the connection between in-game and real-world activities, the claim that acting out particular activities in video games makes individuals more likely to carry out the acts represented in the real world remains controversial. While a number of studies have shown a connection between video game violence and individuals' attitudes and emotional responses towards violence in the short to medium term, the connection between activities in the games and acts in the real world has been much harder to establish. Scientific opinion about the effects of video games on players remains at an empirical deadlock. Many authorities insist that players are quite capable of distinguishing between fantasy and reality, and that correspondingly there is little reason to think that playing games affects the real-world dispositions of those who play them. Thus, the Entertainment Software Association claims that, quote, "The truth is there is no scientific research that validates a link between computer and digital games and violence, despite lots of overheated rhetoric from the industry's detractors." However, video games are used by military organisations across the world to teach the modern arts of war, from how to shoot a gun to teamwork and leadership skills, military values and cultural sensitivity. J.C. Hertz and Michael Macedonia argue that military organisations are increasingly viewing video games as, quote, "powerful tools for learning, socialisation and training." Thus, it seems that the designers and users of military simulations must hold that it is possible to learn skills and consequently alter one's dispositions through practice and simulations. So by a moral agent's dispositions, we mean their tendency to think and act in a particular way under certain conditions. For instance, a glass has the disposition to break when dropped on a hard surface, although it may not do so in every case. We're using the idea of a moral agent's dispositions to emphasise the way in which both skills and motivations involve patterns of responses. We're interested in both the question of whether games can teach people to be better killers and whether they make people more likely to kill. Given how long-running this controversy is and the extent to which participants divide readily into opposed and mutually hostile camps, we suspect that consensus about the effects of video game play on players is unlikely to be reached anytime soon. Our goal in this paper is not, therefore, to try and establish whether video games have ethically troubling effects on game players, but rather to draw attention to an important and under-acknowledged tension between the ways we talk about military simulations and recreational video games. Our arguments may be less controversial for this audience. If you believe that games offer an ethical experience, then you believe they can alter character. However, debates about the ethical effects of video games remain fiercely controversial in the broader cultural debates and within the video game industry. You can also look to debates within the US Supreme Court over regulation of video games and also to the Australian Attorney General's report into whether there should be an R18 plus rating for games. So first I'll introduce the tension we're drawing attention to, and then Rob's going to explore the various ways in which these positions might be reconciled and suggest that all of them seem likely to fail. We conclude, therefore, that either military organisations are wrong to think that video games have the training power they assert they do, or some video games do in fact influence the dispositions of players. So first we'll look at the position that video games are a form of harmless fun, which have little or no effect on the dispositions of the player. Gordon Kalea suggests that video game worlds are typically presented as essentially separate from the real world due to their artificial status and the perception that there's a binary opposition between play and ordinary everyday life. Thus, in a 2007 study into game players' perspectives on gender stereotypes in video games, researchers found that it is common to view video games as harmless entertainment, quote, as opposed to a medium which might impact players' attitudes or behaviours, either positively or negatively. In a common refrain, one participant stated, "Video games aren't responsible for who people are or what they do." Similarly, noted psychologist Christopher Ferguson argues that while video games may transmit raw data or information, they do not influence a player's internal goals, motivation, moral beliefs, or personality traits such as aggressiveness. These sentiments illustrate a tendency to conceive of gameplay as a fantasy realm ethically detached from both the player and the non-virtual world. Nonetheless, many game developers and military experts argue that video games can be powerful tools for learning when used to train soldiers in the arts of war. Michael Macedonia, a former Chief Technology Officer at the US Program Executive Office for Simulation, Training and Instrumentation, contends that game-style simulations have become increasingly vital to US military training programs. Military games have been designed to develop a surprising variety of skills. In commonly used military games like Steel Beasts, Full Spectrum Warrior, Urban Sim and Virtual Battlespace 2, soldiers learn to evaluate and employ different tactics in combat situations, develop their ability to operate in a unit, and build leadership skills. Urban Sim in particular attempts to explore common problems that military leaders may come across in wartime. Players take on the role of an army commander who must make decisions about how to maintain stability, quote, fight insurgency, reconstruct civil infrastructure, and prepare for transition in a war zone. Other games developed from military training tackle the emotional impact of war and interpersonal communication skills. In Tactical Iraqi, soldiers learn to apply information about Iraqi culture and local Arabic language dialects to engagements with simulated local Iraqi civilians. In True Faith and Allegiance, players learn what it means to act in accordance with army values from their teenage years through recruitment and training and into active service. Virtual Iraq is used as a therapeutic tool for soldiers who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, who are guided through virtual environments and provided with opportunities to confront their triggers. The aim of such games, according to the simulation designers, is to create, quote, synthetic experiences so compelling that participants react as if they are real. Their goal, as David Eyre puts it, is to create veterans who've never seen combat. Thus, we can observe two competing tendencies. On the one hand, video games are presented as a form of entertainment, which is insulated from the real world, from real-world effects on the person's character or actions. While on the other hand, video games are presented as powerful learning devices which can change a person's dispositions when utilised for military training. This tension is especially striking given that some of the very same games have been marketed for entertainment and for training purposes. America's Army was designed to be an entertaining recruitment tool for civilians, but has also been used for training by the US military. Popular commercial games such as Call of Duty have been used by military organisations to train soldiers, and Full Spectrum Warrior, which was initially designed for military training, was released on numerous gaming platforms and deemed a critical and commercial success. So now on to Rob.
So it's at least interesting that there's this kind of enormous contradiction between what people say to two different audiences. To the sort of the games industry, when turned to the public face, says, look, this is just good, clean fun. When marketing to the military says, look, we can radically change the way your soldiers behave. So I want to look at now at three different ways that this sort of tension we might attempt to resolve it. Because I take it that many people want to keep playing their first-person shooters, but don't like the idea that they're in fact morally implicated or more likely to go postal as a result. So there's three things I think you might argue. You might say, look, this is a matter of study versus play. When the military use these very same games, they bring a distinct mindset. Okay, so obviously it's more possible, in some circumstances, the conscious desire to learn is going to help you learn. So you might place a lot of emphasis on the intentions of the player. But I think this is not going to work because there's actually, there's some people who come to the commercial recreational games out of an explicit desire to learn a skill set. You know, maybe they want to join a militia, maybe they want to join the military, so they set out to learn whatever the game can teach. But perhaps more importantly, the sort of increasing trend towards gamification of skills shows that as long as you're enjoying yourself, you can learn. So it's not actually necessary to be sit down and say, right, today I'm going to learn this in order to learn this. Games inevitably teach you things. They teach you at least the mechanisms. You know, there's the endless tutorials at the beginning where you have to learn an explicit sort of set of skills, and you get skilled up even though you're just playing for fun. So I don't think you're going to be able to make a distinction between the power of recreational games and military simulations on the basis of the intention of the sort of mindset brought by the players. A more plausible argument wants to make a distinction between, say, games and simulations, or between sort of between the military release and the commercial release, and say there's something about the game, not about the player, that makes a difference to what people come away from the experience. And clearly, if you compare a sort of commercial flight simulator or a military, full cockpit flight simulator to the PC version, it looks plausible to say these are completely different things. There's actually two versions of this argument. One might emphasise the difference, the nature of the embodied experience of the player, so it makes a difference whether you're using a joystick or your actual rifle with a laser pointer attached to it. So it's about the embodied experience of using the device that might make a difference. Or you might claim that this is about the representation, that the military games are more realistic, or there's something about the content of the game that makes a difference. I don't think either of these distinctions are going to reliably map onto the distinction between military and recreational games. It's true that some military simulators are much more all-encompassing than any recreational game, and so it's arguable that they can teach skills that the commercial games can't. So the big, very expensive American combat training systems, they actually put you into a full mock-up of a tank or a helicopter. It's plausible to say they'll teach you to drive a tank or a helicopter, whereas no amount of PC gaming is going to do that. But there is an increasing tendency of recreational games to move towards more realistic interfaces, so the interfaces are changing, and VR technology may close that gap still further, that you're going to get very immersive experiences in commercial gaming quite soon. And of course, not all of the military games are actually that kind of, full experiential simulation. Many games are in fact just the sort of the PC version. So if you can learn from the PC version of the military game, it's going to be hard to explain why you can't from the recreational game. Similar problems beset any claim about a distinct way of representing reality or representing the world in terms of the sort of, how the bullets move or the blood flows. Some recreational games, as we saw earlier today, pride themselves on these very realistic physics engines, very realistic terrains, while some military games or simulators present only the sort of most formal or schematic accounts of the phenomena they aim to represent. In fact, in many circumstances, actually teaching is deliberately very much about stripping reality away. In order to teach people, you present them only with the most salient features. So say, we do this in philosophy all the time. You just remove all the detail and you present a schema, and that's what does the sort of intellectual work. So again, I simply don't think this distinction is going to map nicely onto the difference between the sort of military and the commercial games. You'd also have to explain why those differences led to a difference in the sort of the power of the games to shape dispositions. So I do think there's an argument can be made here about the sort of the full experiential simulators. They may teach skills that the recreational games can't. But remember that the military games are not just teaching, how to be a pilot. They're teaching which targets to attack. They're teaching army values and army ethics. So it seems to me where the weight of the argument in this area is going to rest is on the distinction between skills and vices. And you might want to say, look, we can change people's responses to stimuli in various ways. We can teach skills using recreational games, but what we can't do is change people's ends or their values. That the medium is somehow inert when it comes to the ability to make it more likely that people will do bad stuff. Here's three initial observations. First, some military games are explicitly claimed to teach people ethics. And if you can do that in a military game and you can sell the same game on the commercial market, you can change people's character. And in fact, a lot of the presentations we've seen today just seem to accept that straightforwardly. It actually would be remarkable to think that video games couldn't change people's ends. I mean, if I wanted to say books can't change your values, you know, I can't change what kind of person you are with a book. No one would buy that for a moment. We're constantly handing out Bibles to people to try and make them better people. But if you can do that, you know, you can do that with a book, then you can do that with a video game. In fact, you can shape people's ends with your video games. And of course, in the debate about sexism and racism in representations, if you've got any concerns about, say, racist games or sexism in games, it's because you think the games reshape people's behaviour in the real world. If you haven't already read Morgan Luck's paper, The Gamer's Dilemma, about virtual child pornography, I recommend it to you. And then, if you push on if you look at the concept of disposition we've chosen deliberately to bridge the gap between skills and vices. If you look at what a disposition is, virtues actually look very much like skills. And skills teach ends. If you're learning surgery, you learn the order in which you perform certain, you know, surgical operations. So you learn at least interim ends. So if you're teaching people skills, you are teaching people goals, and you're teaching people a certain way of seeing the world. And of course, values are about how we see the world. So if you can teach that in one context, you can teach it in the other. So I think there's a real problem here. I think that, in fact, either the military is being sold a whole series of very expensive lemons, or a whole lot of people are subjecting themselves to quite a powerful transformative force in their recreational gaming. I'm not going to say which of those is true, and of course the fact that games can teach us things doesn't say all games teach us the same thing, nor does it say what they're teaching us, but they've got, if they work in the military context, then they have to have that power in recreational context. We look forward to your questions.